Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Lee Montville, Director of Special Sales and Business Development at Springer Publishing. Today, we are presenting Thriving in Social Work Education, Supporting Well-Being for Students and Faculty with Doctors Ann Oberman, Kristen Lindsay Danhoff, and Jessica Ritter. All three of our distinguished experts are professors from Metropolitan State University in Denver, Colorado. Before we begin, a quick reminder. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand at www.springerpub.com/videos in 5 to 7 business days post live event. If you have any questions today, please type them into the Q&A box on your Zoom control panel, and I'll bring them up at the end of the presentation. And if you forget to ask a question, there'll be a brief survey sent at the end of the webinar, and you can include your question there. Now, let's get started. I'll turn the presentation over to Dr. Danoff.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Seeing a lot of folks from across the United States. I think I saw Canada too. So welcome to our webinar. And we're really excited to be here with you today and just sort of begin to think about and unpack thriving in this profession. So you can see on the screen here, I'm Kristen Danhoff, and I'm with my colleagues Ann Oberman and Jessica Ritter, and we're coming to you from Denver. So I see a few people in the chat from Denver, so enjoying the cooler day today. But go ahead, I think, to the next slide, Ann. So really kind of setting the stage. We're going to talk a little bit today about service. You know, we enter this field often, largely a component of it is to serve, but we only stay, and we want to stay. We want students and professionals to stay if we are sustained. And so we're going to unpack that a little bit. Framing well-being as a professional competence is something we need to attend to. So we're going to discuss how we got here, talk about an elective that I created and offer, examine student and faculty well-being as interconnected and separate, and then kind of in good social work fashion, take it out a little bit and think macro level implications for programs and policy. And we're going to start to unpack, you know, how we got here. So 25 of us think about well-being all the time. 10% of us practice it all the time, right? Often was kind of similar, and 48% of us only practice professional well-being sometimes. And so I think that's indicative of what's in the literature and what we see, right? And so how we got here is complex. It's so multi-layered. There's so many components that go into our practice, into our professional practice, as students that maybe are sitting in this space and thinking about how you're going to get out and do that work. And we have a value, right, in social work of service. And while it's important, and I believe that's why, again, a lot of us are here, we only can stay in this profession long-term and thrive in this profession, which is what I'm aiming for, if we take care of ourselves. And so if you look at the value of service, it says social workers elevate service to others above self-interest. And in large part, love that. You know, we like to have service, and I just wonder how that gets unpacked, how that gets operationalized, how that is witnessed and felt in social work programs, in our agencies, in all of the places where we work. And I think this is a lesser layer of the complexity of what we think about as professional practice that doesn't get explored. So, you know, service is ethical, I think, when it's sustainable for the clients and for us. And I'm not sure that that's always the case. And I also think that this notion of service gets exploited sometimes. It gets tapped into, this notion of altruism, of, sort of doing good and being of service is overused and sometimes abused. It can provide a lot of meaning to our work, right? And it's also this kind of double-edged sword that it leads to that burnout, because I think service can lead to role creep, can lead to that invisible layer. And then as I was kind of preparing for this, because I have so many thoughts about this topic, it's a passion of mine. It's like, how do we focus in for just a 10-minute little talk? I came across a notion or an idea or a theory around pathological altruism. And I thought that was really interesting. And how could we even start to talk about this, unpack this, name this as social work educators and even professionals? Because that's when the drive to help sort of exceeds healthy boundaries or awareness of the consequences of what we're doing, that service that we're providing. And I think lastly, and Jessica will get to this, more towards the end, is just how do we denormalize overwork? How do we start to celebrate like, oh my gosh, you took a break, you did what you needed to do, you had a boundary versus, oh, you gave and gave and gave, and you just kind of are here all the time for everybody. I think how do we start to change that to be an ethic of care and service, and maybe change that into an ethic of sustainability? How do we talk about sustainability? So next slide, Anne. And I think one of these things, I think it goes all the way up to our code of ethics. I think it goes into our Council of Social Work Education for programs that are accredited. There's small, very small nods to self-care or to doing this work. And largely it's, aspirational. It just kind of says, oh, you should care for yourself. And it's like, okay, great. And there's really no teeth to that. There really no more that's contained in that. And really for the last decade, probably even a bit more, and even probably more here of late, a lot of you will probably shake your head and say, oh, yes, me too, as an educator. I've just witnessed in our students, even in this very pre-career, early career stage, that they're overwhelmed. They're already at points where it feels like there's burnout, there's large amounts of fatigue. And school isn't the only part of that, right? That, being in a social work program isn't the only part of that. But if we know that, some studies, 46% of health workers have reported feeling burnout, and that's up. I mean, I've seen ranges from 20s to 30s, all the way up to almost pushing 70 over time. That, I mean, we know this is a thing, right? And so how can we as educators, if we're kind of sitting in that space here, um, do the work to start to make an impact? And that, I'll get to my elective. That was, my way of thinking through this. But if you've ever said self-care, and I don't know I think I saw maybe a couple of our students even in the chat, but if you've ever said anything to a student or even a colleague, or sometimes even myself, and it's like, oh, you gotta do self-care, you gotta take care of yourself. And like the eye roll, you could either see it visibly, or maybe if you're online, you just like almost feel and hear the like, "Ugh, okay, that sounds great, Dr. Danhoff, please, thanks for saying those words." And I think that's because we don't always model, and we don't have a real focus in our professional educational programs as kind of a standard. And so again, when we think macro, like how do we take that up that level? Because I do think there's some incongruence and misalignment. I also think we assume maybe that everybody knows what self-care is, what well-being might look like for them. So I'll talk a little bit about my research here in a moment, because I don't think that's true either. And so again, how do we start to think about this as a competence and not a perk, not an afterthought, and not an individual only task or responsibility? So how can we build that into our curriculums and think through that? Next slide, Anne. So the course. for my colleagues, Anne and Jessica will know this is my baby, my passion project. I'm very I love this elective for so many reasons, and I think many of my students do too. You can see two of my favorite quotes here from trauma stewardship, and it's really just kind of the start of how I thought about and building this elective that's run for 5, 6 years. I think the first iteration was just around the end of the pandemic, but I think what we see a lot is the fire, and I think fire is important, and I think that flash is key, and that's often what we see and kind of is clear, but that doesn't sustain us, right? If we think about fire, like we need those coals, we need what's inside, we need us to thrive and to be well in order to keep building flames and to keep that movement going. And I also like the work and what they say in trauma stewardship around we can enjoy the world. I know sometimes that feels hard, and we can set it straight. Like it can be both and. And sometimes I think, again, when you get into this work, I'll just name I've burned out. I've experienced this and this fatigue and compassion fatigue and burnout. And so how can we do the both? And so I created this course and have been intentional about how I'm doing it, and really largely, and you'll see this even in the chapter in the fourth edition of the book we have coming out, but I really intentionally brought in a lot of different authors, ideas, models, theorists, just to be broad in how we think about well-being. I tell my students, I'm like, it's not Lululemon pants and smoothies, although that might be a part of your well-being, and it can be, but that doesn't speak to everybody. And so it's much more than that. It's deeper than that. And so I use Healing Justice by Loretta Piles currently as the textbook, but I have Kristen Lee in there for the reset model, positive psychology, values and action from Martin Seligman, all the way to Resmaa Menakem and My Grandmother's Hands and thinking about trauma and intergenerational trauma, Prentice Hemphill. I've got polyvagal theory in there. I've got Tara Brach with radical compassion, David Treleaven with trauma sensitive mindfulness, and more. I'm rambling off a few here, but I've kind of chosen very intentionally to, I don't know if I call it deconstruct, but just think broadly about how we do this, because it's not just a mind approach. I mean, we spend a lot of time with our thinking brain and focusing on that, but there's a very body, mind, soul sort of approach that I've taken to this, to think about our neurology, our biology, our neurobiology, and how that comes in, our psychology, also a lot around regulation and how do we regulate our bodies and mend that trauma, thinking about social justice, again, bringing in those different voices. So I just make it very active. I start with, the first assignment is called Start Where You Are with What You Have. And we just build up from that. And we think about a compassionate care plan and strengths. And we do a little small community sort of group project to kind of take it out. We start close in. And then, again, good social work fashion, how do we sort of think about our community, where we're situated, and how can we maybe make change? So um, that's one way I think. Currently, it's an elective. Maybe that says something still about how we need to elevate it. But that's kind of where we've started. So I'm going to quickly go into, I know I'm talking fast, so such limited time to get all this information out, but the next slide is about my research study that I've done as a part of the course. And so I've taken student assignments, and I've done some qualitative data analysis with my colleague Ann Oberman and a couple of our former students and students that took the class. Was just a phenomenal experience, which again, I think is another way to really elevate this notion of well-being. But we kind of unpacked their final assignment, and again, to give voice. So 66% of the respondents were social work majors. I did it for the very first iteration of the course. 58% were 18 to 24, and then 17 were 45 to 54. So again, kind of a broad demographic there. 50% identified as Hispanic, 25% identified as some sort of other kind of BIPOC identity. and 25% were white. So I love the diversity in the sample. In good fashion, 92% were women. So, there's that. And, over half were earning less than, $30,000 a year. So these are the voices that are coming in. And I'll, again, try and quickly go through these themes. I'm working on getting this article out. But there was really an awakening by taking this elective that one student said, I've learned I don't have to sell my soul to be a social worker. I mean, like, wow, okay, that's what they're realizing. I was taught that self-care would come around to those who could wait and get a good enough job. It was something only the rich could afford. But feeling like through the work in the class, they can see the micro moments, they can see the other ways they can care for themselves. So that to me, I was like, well, that's amazing. This notion again of reclaiming, redefining well-being, which I love, that it doesn't have to be this thing that costs or this big, huge event, that the more we can do it, the more micro doses even that we can do make an impact. Someone said many people like me had a small understanding, that they didn't understand what self-care was or didn't see themselves sort of in that movement. Compassion and community, it was a big part. Being a part of this elective, I've only offered it in person. There's a big push for me to put it online, and I'm slowly working that direction. And I struggle because this community piece has been so important. I'm learning I don't have to carry this burden alone. I mean, how important is that? The same way I want to help and listen to people, others are willing to do that for me, right? That's super powerful. This one was just very well said. If we radiate holistic well-being, we will inevitably have an effect on those closest to us. It eventually will create a tidal wave, love that ripple, amongst all peoples and heal generational trauma, right? Like spending this very pointed quality time on well-being is impacting these students in such a profound way. Or at least that's how I'm taking the information. And then trauma. Again, a lot of students, like they know that they've had a lot of things in their life, but really naming and focusing and saying things about trauma was important to them. I have yet to find the right words to describe how much this course has served me, mostly because it is still a work in progress. It is not easy to face the areas that we have repressed for so long. So again, really naming some of these pieces, setting these students up to get out into the field. So that's a quick snippet of my passion and my work in this and my research. And I will turn it now over to Anne to talk a little bit more.
Thank you, Kristen. I'm Ann Oberman, and I just want to say that Kristen has been our pebble or our tidal wave, whichever way you want to look at it. But throwing that pebble into how our team, and we're a BSSW, so we're an undergraduate team that we work on. We have a master's program as well. But those pebbles of how do we take care of ourselves? What does it mean to be faculty? What does it mean to integrate what Kristen has found in her research into our classrooms? And so that pebble, I feel like, has really created, whether a tidal wave or just really big, movement in our lake or our ocean. And so I get to share more about how we're integrating that. So I'm going to be talking about students and faculty and how we are looking at well-being in those applied settings. And so it really brought us to a lot of conversations about what does that mean? And so we can check the box that we're talking about self-care, or that they're doing self-care plans and internship, but how else does this look? And so as we talked about that, we were talking with students, we used Kristen's data, we came to some different areas, and this is not exhaustive at all, but some of the different areas that we were talking about. So I'm going to start more to the right. I'm not going to go in left to right order here, but we established that we're all in this together. And so the way that we established our curriculum, we are thinking about students' well-being and how they're creating those skills. But we are also thinking about faculty and how are we grading our papers? How are we lighting our fires in our classrooms and addressing all the competencies? And so that's one example of how we thought about how are we in this wellness thing together in our department as we're preparing students and honoring students and their well-being. And so that shows up in a lot of different ways, whether again, it's in our curriculum creation, or whether it's in the way that we throw our events and honor our students, that we do those things to build joy and resiliency, as well as talking about the challenges and giving skills to students to make sure that they're thriving in those early careers. So teaching them about supervision, teaching them about how do they advocate for themselves in their initial placements? How do they interview so that they can ask questions about if that system provides care to them or if it's a priority in that mission? And so really being in it together. That owning well-being, Kristen talked about their research around students renaming and reclaiming what that might mean. And so giving students the power to be well. And so that came a lot in some of our grading policies and some of our flexibility around attendance. And so what would it mean for that student to take a mental health day? Do we ding them for that? Do they get one free absence this semester? And so thinking about how they owned their well-being and empowering them to do that. And so that also flows into that flexibility and structure icon on the screen with regards to having structure and having students know what's expected of them, but building in flexibility so they're really able to take care of themselves and own what that means for them in our education, for sure, to start with. And then we talk more about internship and those when they launch into their career path there. What we found, and many of you probably experienced this as well, is through COVID, we were extremely flexible. And so we were able to kind of see that flexibility without structure didn't support well-being as much as we thought for both faculty and students. And so being able to have a balance, so students know what is expected of them, which gives people comfort, which gives people ability to take care of themselves and track, but also to provide flexibility within that structure and that predictability that allows students to have room to get sick, to take care of their loved ones. We have a lot of caretakers at our program and a lot of students that are working full-time, part-time. And so how are they able to balance all those amazing things that they're doing? So figuring out how to have that flexibility, I still think we need to consistently give students the permission to take that flexibility. We build it in, but a lot of students don't necessarily take that. And so talking about what does it mean to miss class? What does it mean to maybe turn in a late paper or to just get a B on a paper instead of striving for that A? And so having those discussions of what's expected of them, what they need to show up, what they need to be well, they get to practice in our program while we're going. And so that's really important. And we have a lot of room to grow in those areas as well, but that was some of the intentional thinking that we thought about. So those examples are also part of just integrating well-being in our implicit and explicit curriculum. So when you think about those well-being plans or self-care plans that students often do during internship, those are kind of those explicit ways. And we see that in, offering an elective, being able to discuss those things, having students do readings around that, having them have that as part of their competencies and learning plan during internship, but also integrating it in our implicit curriculum, meaning like, how are we offering students ways to engage with one another, that they're able to uplift each other, that it feeds them, that they're able to get those things from our website, from the way we give information, from our newsletters. And so we've been talking about the different ways our culture and climate integrates well-being. And I'll talk about that in a minute as well with faculty and how we model that, because that's often the implicit piece that speaks louder to students than us saying, yes, well-being is important, but then meanwhile, we're modeling doing everything or stretching ourselves too thin. So that's a really important part with balancing between implicit and explicit ways. Taking a little bit of a paradigm shift, and I know this is true with a lot of different things that we're doing, but from individual to systemic. And so from self-care to systemic care, moving our understanding of who's responsible for that well-being, and how do our institutions, how do our agencies, how do those field internships, how are they providing and organizing their systems? So Jessica will talk more about that at that macro level. with regards to making sure that we do that shift so that students know that, yes, they need to monitor their own well-being and take care of that. And we need to create systems and put systems in place and policies. And so giving students those skills as well to change those systems. And finally, balancing reality and hope. And so I don't know about you all, but it's been a very dynamic 6-7 years between politics, public health, many different things. And as social workers and academics, we can get real critical. We can get real into the weeds around like what's not working and what we need to do and constantly deconstructing stuff. And so balancing that, students have given us the feedback that one way of supporting well-being is making sure our programs balance reality and hope. So while giving them the skills they need to be well and take care and to navigate and be change makers in these systems that are often difficult and have challenges, also providing that hope and that joy in what they're doing. And a lot of the work that Kristen and Kristen can provide a lot of the names that she shared around who framed her well-being elective, but a lot of that is about joy. And so taking the lead around what is social work joy, right? And how do we dwell in that and bathe in that joy so that then when we go back into those challenges and talking about what is difficult, that we can balance those two pieces together. So these are just some things that students have given us feedback and that we've integrated into our curriculums and what we're doing. So to shift gears, now we're going to talk about faculty. And again, we're in it together. So these things bleed between students and faculty at every single one of these areas. And so just to name well-being in academia, Kristen talked about mind, body, soul. Academia has been very heavily, if not completely, in mind. And so, and oftentimes when you talk about the body soul piece of it, you're seen as not as rigorous or a little bit duff on the side. Like it's not what is as respected. And so to bring in, how are we being well? How do our bodies feel? How are we healthy? Are we sitting in these chairs all day long? Even talking about that is a culture shift within academia. And I think other areas of our work life in this world have adopted well-being quicker than academia because it's so focused on the mind and what has been considered rigorous and evidence-based and all these pieces that we're taught, right, to do. And so it's often not addressed as much systemically in academia. And so bringing these conversations in to what does it mean to be well? So that's just one context piece. So if we're good, person and environment here and ecological model, thinking about what that system is that we are all in. And so we have that system, and then students launch into their professional social work arenas. But we are in the soup of academia. So just knowing that's there. Also, our current context is super dynamic. It's unpredictable. Academia is being doubted, right? As far as what is that value? And so there's constant input coming at us that is challenging and that is depleting, and it's impacting everyone. So since COVID and then through the academic or academia context of being doubted with regards to return on investment and what we have to offer, those things can wear on us. And so now you find faculty, you're finding leaders, you're finding institutional presidents, students, their well is very shallow, or it's not very deep. And so we're pulling from oftentimes that dry cup. And so we're all impacted. So what does that mean for us as we come into the classroom together? And so I'm going to skip down to what to bring in. And so we often have that discussion when you're hearing news and you're driving into work and things hit you to your core. And Jessica teaches our policy class. And so being able to walk in and have to explain kind of what does this even mean? Do I even have framework to discuss what's going on right now? And I just want to cry, right? There are times that Jessica was texting me on the way into work, like, I just listened to this, whatever it was, example, and weeping in your car, and then you're going in to talk about the exact same thing with students. And so knowing that, like, how transparent are we? How much do we just stick to our course agenda that day? Because sometimes students don't want to sit there and process the whole class either. But how much do we bring in? And so that was a new conversation that we really honored with one another in our team about what that means. And I think all faculty are dealing with this, not just those in social science or, political science, different fields that are, the content kind of bleeds over with our current context. But all folks are feeling this. And so again, with our students, we are in it together. They are also arriving. With the recent SNAP shutdown, I don't know about you all, but students would come in and they didn't have food, they didn't have finances and resources to pay for what they're doing. And when you have that discussion with a student and they're talking with each other, and then you're going in and talking about your class, how do we care for one another, give time for that, and also honor that we're doing education and doing those pieces. So we've been talking about that. And then role modeling. So that kind of piggybacks off of what to bring in with regards to how do we role model being well. And so what to bring in is one part of that. But another thing that Kristen has done is this whole idea of role modeling saying no and saying, I believe in this program 100%, and I am 100% behind students, and I can't do this one more thing. And so often when resources are tight, uh, we as faculty are asked to do more in the classroom to compensate maybe for some of these other services within academia that can't be met because of budgets or because of other reasons. And so how do we say no while still supporting? And how do we support each other in saying no? And that's even hard within social work. Back to that service value that Kristen talked about at the beginning. We often want to help, and we want to, sometimes our identities are tied up with helping people and saving in those ways. And so really role modeling with students saying no, not answering emails at all hours of the night, telling students they're not going to get their papers back until Monday. I'm not grading this weekend. Really role modeling those self-care pieces. And finally, work-life balance. And so I say this because we often talk about work-life balance. But within academia, how do we do work and do it well, but also do what we love? And so part of that is that role modeling in saying no and having those boundaries, choosing the things that we love. And so Kristen has just jumped into well-being because it feeds her soul, right? And so being able to maybe say no to this committee or this opportunity because this piece also feeds. And so be thinking about faculty well-being. If we have administrators on this webinar, how are you getting your faculty to do what they love? And again, it's not separate from students. How are we doing that in our classrooms as well? So now to pass it off to the larger, taking it out broader, how are we doing this in macro settings? I'm going to pass it off to Jessica.
Excellent. So we're moving into the final stretch of our presentation here where we'll focus on a macro lens to well-being. So there have been a few experts and scholars of well-being, and Dr. Danhoff is one of them who I know has this perspective, which is that we need to have a macro lens to this topic, that for a long time, there's been this very individual lens to it, meaning that, people are responsible for their own well-being. And while that's true, like to some degree, that is part of the picture, is that we do think about as individuals all the things we can do personally to support our well-being. We know that that's not the full picture. So this ending part here is for us to explore what that really means. Like what responsibility does the larger society have? What responsibility do our workplaces have to supporting our well-being? So I have 4 questions that I would love to reflect on with you, and we're going to try to wrap up hopefully by 10:45 because we want you to be able to ask some questions. So the first question is, what does well-being look like when we're doing macro level practice? I don't have any data to support what I'm about to say, so it's a hunch. But I'm guessing that if you look at a lot of social work curriculums where we talk about well-being and self-care, that it likely shows up in our more micro and meso level courses. And that makes sense in a lot of ways, right? Because those are where we talk about the trauma that we work with at those levels. And we talk about vicarious traumatization. and the impact that has on social workers. And so it's really important that it shows up there. But I also think it needs to show up in our more macro level classes, right? When we think about the work that social workers do to change systems and to change policies, it's different. Perhaps the toll it takes on you as a social worker is a little bit different. But I think we all know it's still equally challenging, right? And I have put that on my own agenda because when I think about, I teach policy and I'm a big policy person. Honestly, working with Kristen and even thinking about this webinar, I've realized, I don't know that I bring this content in enough in my policy class and even in my policy book. So it's really helped me to think about how I'm going to start doing more there. The next two questions I think really dovetail nicely together. So how can macro social workers sustain themselves when working in a very challenging social and political environment like we're in right now? And then how can we avoid social justice burnout and activism fatigue? And those were new terms to me, honestly, until recently. I understood the concept behind it, that people who do social justice work get burned out, of course. But I didn't know that there were some folks out there that had named them. And so if you go out and Google social justice burnout and activism fatigue, you're going to find some really interesting articles where people are writing about these topics. So I'll just share some things that I have come across over the years where people talk about, especially in the area of political advocacy work, that are important in terms of sustaining ourselves and to not get burned out. And what you'll find in the literature is that people talk about the importance of celebration, right? That you celebrate wins when they happen in a really important way, that we think about connection and community doing that work. I think anyone who's done policy work knows you often don't do it alone. You're working with groups of people, like-minded people. And so that's that kind of connection that really sustains you doing the work. But the thing that we overlook sometimes, and there have been people who have written about this, is joy. I'll go back to Anne. You know, Anne was talking about bringing joy to social work, but you can bring joy and fun to policy advocacy work. And I'm going to give you just a really fun, concrete example of this. When I was living in Portland, Oregon, there were, this is back when President Obama was in office. And you might remember, if you were around during that time, that there was a big push for some advocates to move the country towards a very different healthcare system, and in particular, if we could move to a single payer healthcare system. And so there was this really interesting grassroots group called the Mad as Hell Doctors, and I found them so interesting. So I started, watching them, and I ended up writing about them in my policy book. And I brought students to one of their rallies that they held in Portland, so they could just experience what it would feel like to go to a political rally. And what was so fascinating is that, yes, it was very serious. These were doctors and nurses and other folks that worked in healthcare, including social workers. And they were using the language of, we're mad as hell, because they knew that a lot of people in this country don't have access to healthcare that's so needed. And so they were there sharing those really important, serious stories, but they coupled it with fun. And so they had music and musicians and singers, and so there was this really fun, joyful element to the rallies, which was a good learning experience for me to realize that we need to bring those into a lot of our policy work. And then finally, how can social workers demand more from the organizations where we work? And Anne was sort of, referencing this when she was talking, so that this is a shared responsibility, because we know that the individual can't do this alone. And so I'm going to think about this on the student-facing side and on the faculty side. The first thing that comes up for me is that we are often preparing students for leadership roles in their organization. So these are our future leaders, right? Going into these leadership positions. And so I think that we can really help prepare them for the change that they could create to make sure that we have really good work, love, life balance with the employees, setting the norms and the culture and the policies within organizations that really supports a nice balance. And then on the faculty facing side, I think about our universities where we work, and what we could be doing more in terms of faculty. I know on our campus, faculty have actually been quite vocal in talking about workload demands and what should the right teaching loads be. And I guess I would just argue that, social work faculty in particular are uniquely positioned to be leaders on college campuses, you know, in terms of the values that we come from, the skill set that we have, that we could really be leaders on our campuses to demand more in terms of a good love life balance. So I will go ahead and end there because I know that we did want to move into some final thoughts and then opening it up for some questions here. We did have some tidbits of care that we would want to share from you. So we'll just show you this slide for now. And I think what we're going to do is come back to this slide. We all, Kristen and Ann and I came up with our top 3, you know, tips that we would share of what we've done for our own well-being. And we might come back to this slide because we do want to.
Thanks very much. We do have some questions, and I just want to remind everyone that they could put any questions you have in the Q&A, and I can ask those questions. Thank you again, Doctors Oberman, Danhoff, and Ritter. It was really, really a great presentation so far. The first question we have is, how can faculty model healthy boundaries and self-care for students?
I mean, I can start. It goes a little bit back to some of our tidbits. If you want to go back to that slide, even I mean, it's one of the things I didn't sort of explicitly even name when I was talking was um, how do we even take out martyr rewards as kind of a label out of our curriculum? So Anne talked about, you know, attendance policies. How can we have it so that students are learning responsibility and they're learning to show up in professional settings, and is 100% really needed, necessary, and does that really support well-being? And are we even 100% all the time? I would argue no. So, you know, some of those pieces, I just am very clear in my boundaries, and this is a journey. I mean, this elective came out of my own well-being journey and my own exploration, and you know, it's taken me a while, and I'm still working on those boundaries and thinking about my own capacity and what I have to give. And so being clear in those and being kind to myself and others with those, so that I can really demonstrate and show students in that way. And a couple of the ways I do that is I just tell students I do not respond to emails on the weekend. I that is my space for me and my balance and my life. That you know, I there are things that come up, but I just, you know, and very rarely there have been times, but by and large I'm not looking at and I'm not responding to emails on the weekend. But I'm clear with students about that so that they understand, and I talk about why. um, I have a 3-day grace policy for assignments, because am I really getting in at 1:01 a.m. on Monday to start grading assignments that are due by midnight on Sunday? No. I'm probably not even doing it Monday and Tuesday, right? I got other things that are coming into my, so, you know, I'm not in there right away. It gives them just a little space to decide, no, I want to submit this thing Sunday because I got other things to do. Or, gee, Dr. Ritter and Dr. Danhoff have assignments due on the exact same Sunday. I'm going to do this one first. I'm going to give myself, hopefully they're not, you know, doing it last minute, but I don't control that. But again, just kind of thinking through. So those are some ways that I model, and I'm very clear, and I mean, I just very clearly talk about this as, you know, a passion of mine. And so I name it a lot, are definitely ways that I model. I think that was the question.
Yeah, I could just throw in really quickly that we have such a strong team at the undergraduate level in particular here. And so I think that what I try to do I'm trying to think about it, how explicit this is, whether I talk about it or they just sort of see it. But when you have a job that you love, first of all, I think it models for students the importance of finding a job that does bring you a lot of joy. And also to be very intentional about working with people that support you. And so I do think that students see that and feel that on the team that we have. So I think that's one way of modeling for students.
Awesome. Thank you so much. The next question we had was, What role should leadership play in creating a culture of well-being within social work programs?
Hmm, hmm, hmm.
Can jump in. Is that I didn't know what you were thinking there, Jessica, if you were going someplace or if
Yeah,
is
you
that
go
all
for
right?
it, Anne. Go for it.
I think the same is true with the role modeling of ourselves to our students, and that we're in this work together. And so I think the more that we can partner and talk about what is impacting us, including leadership, which our leadership models are very much, you don't share maybe what you're struggling with those that you are leading. There's a lot of that in our traditional leadership models. And so coming together and sharing what those challenges are, sharing what leaders are struggling with, I think that role models well-being, having leaders that, again, back to Kristen's comment about martyrdom, like having leaders that don't respond after 5 o'clock, that don't send emails at, 4 a.m. in the morning. Those different pieces of really role modeling. I think also advocating for us at the executive leadership level at the university. So faculty have faculty senate often, and so we can express ourselves in those ways. And that's where a lot of our workload conversation comes up, was within Senate. But when our leaders can represent that voice and balance it with what the institution needs are, and that our happiness and our work-life balance is just as important as balancing that budget because it retains us. So for their bottom line as well. And so I think that role modeling, I think advocating and that middle management role, which I know is hard. So our chairs and our deans really going to bat for us and how that's balanced and balancing it out with student needs. Oftentimes, I think we all rush in to figure out what those student needs are. And so how are student needs and faculty staff needs balanced? So I think those are some important ways that our leadership can help.
And I'm just going to jump in here real quick. And I think there was a question in the comments, but I mean, there is research out there that, does give support, lend data, because we know sometimes data speaks at different levels and to different people around. And again, it's in my opinion, it's a little bit limited. It's often focusing on sort of mindfulness and mindfulness based sort of 8-week kind of trainings, but there is data out there about this and what it does to students, but also to faculty or to educator, if you're looking at social work around what this does to sort of prevent, mitigate burnout, support well-being in certain ways. And so there is starting to get to be some data out there, but again, I think I would just love to see it broadened. It's why I'm sort of doing some of the research that I'm doing, is that we kind of think of it sometimes, I think, in narrow ways, and there's a lot that we can do to regulate and to unpack and to take care of ourselves in the small and the micro moments which build up, right, over time, like kind of like sand on the beach, right? Like one little, but the more we do it. So there is some data that might help speak to leadership and do some of that work too.
So there was a question that just came into the Q&A, which is kind of very topical and political, which is IU just removed a social work professor from her class for the first time following a DEI language complaint. What do you have to say about how we can be advocates for others on our campuses while we're being directly attacked?
Hmm. Can you say that one more time? I just want to take that question in really carefully.
Sure, sure. It is IU, Indiana University, just removed a social work professor from her class for the first time following a DEI language complaint. What do you have to say about how we can be advocates for others on our campuses while we're being directly attacked.
A big sigh. Yes.
Yeah, this is the moment we're in, right?
We definitely have been talking about, again, this is what do we bring into the classroom? What do we not? How do we support well-being? And also our mission and vision of social work. And so social work is charged with and called to disrupt and call out oppression in all situations. We are called and given skills to stand up for those that are marginalized and how that impacts systems. And so when we're talking about somebody losing their job for following social work mission and vision, I think a real important way to speak up is to talk about what the mission and vision of social work is, what our competencies are, and how talking about DEI, using the words diversity, equity, inclusion, using that language is part of our profession. And so being able to rely on our code of ethics, I think, is a good way to be able to stand up, with at the same time knowing that our own well-being and people's livelihoods are tied up in the language or in these proclamations and or institutional decisions on policing language. And so I think it is a time to be generous and kind to one another, but also to rely on our mission and vision and code of ethics to advocate for ourselves and others as we start speaking. Potentially also relying on institutions. So in Colorado, our state politics are are much more hospitable to social work values. And so relying on each other's outside of our states, outside of our universities, where it may not be safe for programs. If you want to maintain your social work program, it might not be safe to fight those battles at that time. And so relying on the Council of Social Work Education, going into National Association of Social Work, being able to come together, I think are ways that will help navigate this time, but it's very difficult times. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you said that so well, Anne. I think that the thing that was coming up for me as I was thinking this through is we have to acknowledge that it feels risky and it takes a lot of courage. And that's why it's scary. In these moments, we feel scared, right? Because there's some level of risk involved when we speak up and we advocate. But I think, Anne saying we have to stay really grounded in our values, which is really important. And I think remembering that we don't do it alone. And so the more that we do this in groups and we support each other, you just can't do it alone. So we have to come together and we're more powerful as a group to do that work.
And
Excellent.
sorry, I just want to, and that I think includes well-being as a part of that. I mean, I think what we've talked about today is of trying to take care of yourself, have some of those boundaries, do some of that work when, I mean, it's hard. I mean, it is hard out there. And I think, how do you build that within, just with even in colleagues that you work with? Maybe it's not your whole entire program or your department or your school or however big. Like, how do you build that community? Yes, we're not in this alone. And I think building that community also around wellness and boundaries and all of those things that are even harder in these times is important.
That's great. And I'm sure that there will be more discussions and more webinars down the road around these topics. So if you can please move to the next slide, that would be great. And
This
perfect.
one? Oh, yeah.
Yep, that's perfect. And I want to thank everyone for spending time with us today, and thank you again to our hosts, Doctors Oberman, Danhoff, and Ritter, for a great presentation. As you can see on the screen now, if you're interested in purchasing the presenter's book, 101 Careers in Social Work, 4th edition, it's publishing next week, and you can order it on our website, www.springerpub.com, and you will receive a 25% discount if you use the code webinar25 at checkout. And as
Chapter 4 is all about wellness, well-being. So just so you know, that chapter 4 is kind of what the webinar is. Sorry to interrupt, Lee.
No, please, that's great. That's very helpful. And we hope that everybody attending today will not only take advantage, but also share that information with their friends and colleagues. In addition, I want to reiterate that the recorded session will be available on springerpub.com within 5 to 7 business days. Thank you again, Drs. Oberman, Danhoff, Ritter. And we want to wish everyone a great afternoon. And we look forward to you joining us for future Springer Publishing webinars. Have a great day. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks so much for coming.